Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcasts, where we interview innovative change makers and creative people who are making a difference in our world. I'm Deborah Levine, editor of the American Diversity Report and your podcast host. And with me today is Luis Martinez-Fernandez. He is the Pegasus Professor of History at the University of Central Florida and a weekly syndicated columnist at Creators Syndicate. Right. He's a multiple award-winning author who has recently reinvented himself as this syndicated columnist. Welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a pleasure to chat with you.
Absolutely. How wonderful that we can come together. I'm in Chattanooga, you're in Florida.
Yes.
To have this discussion and share it with our readers. So tell us about yourself and about how you came to be in the field of history and why.
Yes, well, history, my vocation, and my life are intertwined. And I see it as something almost inevitable because when I was a small child, actually, I was born in Cuba in 1960. That was the second year of the Cuban Revolution. And my family decided wisely, I would say, to leave Cuba because of the deterioration of the democratic system that existed. It was, well, actually, I should take that back. Democracy did not end with the Castro Revolution. Democracy had ended with the previous dictatorship. But in any event, matters were becoming very difficult. And it was a revolution. And my father decided to leave, and we went to Peru when I was just 2 years old. And then we lived through another military coup in 1968. So I was really surrounded by history, so that by age 10, I had been in exile once, maybe twice, and I had gone through all of these processes, which shaped me. And my vocation was to figure all of that out.
Figure it all out. Oh my, that's quite an undertaking, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a heavy load for a preteen to carry.
Yes, it is. How did you end up in Florida?
Good question. Well, actually, when we left Cuba, we arrived in Miami for a few weeks, and the situation there was that there were so many Cubans coming and not enough jobs. So my father was able to get a position in, of all places, Lima, Peru, because the company for which he had worked in Cuba had an opening there. Then in 1970, we returned to the Caribbean. Basically, I had to relearn the Caribbean, so different from Lima, Peru. And I came to this country in 1986 to pursue a doctorate. And I had plans to return to Puerto Rico, but I've stayed and I've made a career here. And I can't complain. It's been a good career.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you. Not many people have seen firsthand what you have, that's for sure.
Yes, it's a blessing and a quote unquote curse if you're a historian or an anthropologist. You just can't help but see phenomena around you and try to analyze them. For example, tomorrow, the opening ceremonies in the Beijing Winter Olympics. Well, people just turn on the TV and enjoy the acts and the music. And but as a historian, I can't help it but see through the symbolisms, the context. I still enjoy it, don't get me wrong. But that's where I get materials for my columns. So this week's column will be on the opening ceremonies, and not just that, but what ceremonies in Olympics, both opening and closing, have meant as far as a projection of a national culture as far as how nations want to brand themselves when they have the world's eyes on them. So it's very interesting.
Oh, what a great idea. I definitely need to read that.
Oh, sure.
Yes, and it is. Well, as you say, those of us who are historians and anthropologists, we look at it and we don't just see the pomp and ceremony, right? We see what they're wearing and the colors and how they're putting it together, the movements, everything that goes into it, every little detail has meaning.
Yes, these are very carefully planned and choreographed. And I think those who watch those ceremonies get a lot out of them if you're also looking at them with those eyes, understanding that there's meaning behind each song that is. I remember the closing ceremonies of the Beijing Summer Olympics 2008. And as you know, at the end, they have a little segment for the city that will host the next Olympics 4 years from there. And it was London. And I was, uh, those opening and closing ceremonies in Beijing were kind of militaristic. And at least I read them that way. But then at the end, when they have the double-decker bus and Jimmy Page coming out of it and playing rock and roll, it was a big contrast. And then in 2012, I was just fascinated by the show that they put in together in London, which was about diversity. It was about pride in the national health system. It was a different tone and a different message.
Yes, I'm sure that it was. Have you been to London also?
I have been. One of the great blessings of being a historian and a comparative historian is that you have to go to where the sources are. So I've been to London, and actually, of all my books, one of these are like children, right? My dearest one is entitled Fighting Slavery in the Caribbean, which is the life of a British family in 19th century Havana. And I came across their documents at Duke University Library, and I just fell in love with this family from the 1850s. And they had their diaries. He had his, she had another one. They had letters, just a wonderful collection of documents. And years later, when I visited London, I was able to pinpoint the house where they lived, their neighborhood, the church that they attended. It was a wonderful experience, and historians must travel to where the sources are. At
Yes.
least that's what we tell funders that we need to.
Oh my. When I was 17 and I had graduated from high school, my father was determined that I needed to travel a bit before I went to Harvard, went to college. So I would have that much more global mindset, big thinking. And we went to London, right? And we stayed with some people we had met in Bermuda when they moved there during World War II to escape the bombing. And so I
Yes.
ended up staying with them on a place you'll probably know, on Harley Street.
Not familiar with
Harley,
that street.
Harley
No.
Street is a historic street of doctors, medical people
Okay.
where they live. And I didn't know that until you got there. And then all of a sudden, I'm part of history. And that's what I try to tell people. We are all
Yes,
part of history. Pay attention.
we are.
Yeah.
We
And
are, especially in the last few decades, history has been transformed, and it ceased to be what it used to be, which was, you know, quote unquote, famous people, the generals, the politicians. And we had the advent of social history during the 60s and 70s. So, and that's very attractive to me. Much of what I write is about what historians would consider the footnotes of history. Yet it's those footnotes of history that have the most interesting stories to tell.
Absolutely. Tell us about your books and your favorite ones.
Well, I'm a very busy guy. So I've written quite a few books. My first book was my dissertation, which was Torn Between Empires. Almost all my titles have verbs, action verbs in them. And that was a comparative history of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, between empires in the 19th century. My next book, which is the one that I mentioned, Fighting Slavery in the Caribbean, uh, was was an opportunity to do something that unfortunately historians don't do as much, and that is storytelling. There's a tendency to think of storytelling as sort of being shallow and not sophisticated enough, but that's not the case. You can express and you can analyze through storytelling. And just in a nutshell, this was a young family from London, and he worked at the Foreign Office. And all of a sudden came this opportunity for a post abroad. And abroad was in Havana, where the slave trade was thriving and a lot of corruption. And this poor young man is sent to Havana as if he could put an end to that. So he had enormous difficulties. The diaries are very rich in their daily life, the places that they visited, their relationship with neighbors, even their struggles with health, struggles with with not being able to practice their own faith because they were Anglicans, and in Havana and Cuba at that time, that was illegal. So it allowed me to tell this beautiful story. And by the way, you know, when you get these characters out of the underground, you don't know what's going to happen. So a few years later, I got an email from a London, I don't think London, but an English novelist, that he had sort of borrowed my characters, the ones that I unearthed, the Backhouse family, and he wrote a novel about them. And then a few years later, somebody else, another novelist from the United States, got a hold of those characters that I pulled out of the ground and made them key characters in his own novel. So that's a fascinating thing. You never
Love
know.
it. Yeah, that's
Yes.
wonderful, amazing.
Yeah.
Well, stories have been part of humanity since forever, and for a good
Yes.
reason.
Yes. And then, mm, well, you know, I said earlier that your books are your like children. My most troublesome child was a book that I wrote, which I had a strong sense of responsibility that I must write that book. And that book is a history of the Cuban Revolution. The title is Revolutionary Cuba, a History. It covered from pre-1959, sort of the background to the revolution, all the way to the time about when the book was about to come out. Um, Unfortunately, and I'm still very proud of that book, and some reviewers have found it to be a very complete book. Um, when you write about Cuba, particularly the Cuban Revolution, you sort of um, move the ground, and all sorts of creatures come out. And unfortunately, and they would have to speak for themselves, there's still many Viva Cuba voices in this country and in Europe and the rest of the world as well. Um, Unfortunately, Cuba is going through its most difficult times, not just in terms of the material goods that are unavailable to the population, but the extent of the repression. And I really can't understand why scholars who fancy themselves as being progressive can just not just stay quiet, but applaud what's happening in Cuba. So I had a sense of mission, because so much about what has been written about the Cuban Revolution is sort of applauding the Castro regime, and many silences. And I felt I must do that, whatever happens, whatever the consequences. And there were consequences, but I'm living with them. And as I said, when we were preparing for this conversation, I have sort of moved away a little bit from the field of history per se to become a weekly syndicated columnist.
Yeah, I understand. Oh my, it is complicated. Before the revolution, my father, after World War II, became part of a sales group and ended up in Cuba.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, and visited his fellow Jews there,
Mhm.
the Jewish community in Cuba. But that was a long time ago. But he still talked about it. It wasn't that he was a historian, but he understood that writing about it, documenting it, having the letters, putting everything together for people was so important. He eventually became the CFO of the American Jewish Archives. So I really applaud what you do. It's so important to have that there. I know the consequences must be interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
But
We're not in the business of pleasing people. We're in the business of finding truth and sharing it. So,
yes,
but
indeed.
yes, Havana was a city with a sizable Jewish population, and they left a mark, definitely. And most of them left Cuba 1959, 60, 61, and ended up in Miami and other places.
They did. They were not about to stay. If they could get out, they did. Yeah. And
Actually, there's some stories of Jewish pop people who lived in Cuba who were Jewish, who had escaped uh, Nazi expansionism in Europe, and then they had to escape once again uh, when Castro took over. Of course, they're not equivalent. I don't want to give that impression.
no, I understand, but it they had to keep their bags packed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, it's always fascinating to hear the different history of people. The Jewish history. A lot of folks ended up in Cuba and Latin America for many, many decades
Yes.
to escape, and then had to rethink what they were doing. It's part of the change that we have seen in this last century. People moving around so much,
Yeah.
and it's so more important then to have that history so it doesn't get lost.
Yes. And it doesn't get falsified either.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I'm delighted to hear that you're doing weekly columns. I know what that takes. It takes time and effort and a
Yes.
lot of editing. So
Yeah, it's like, dairy farmers. When you have cows, you have to milk them every day. So if you're a weekly syndicated columnist, there's no vacation. There's not, oh, this week I don't feel like milking the cows. You have to uh, continuously produce these. And the challenge is not just to produce anything, but to produce something that is interesting, something that is different and profound. Anybody can write anything, but when you have those standards for yourself, then that makes it a little bit harder.
well, that's why they read you, because you're unique and meaningful.
Well, thank you.
Whether they agree with you or not, they know they're going to get something of you know, interest and purpose and something that
Yes.
they can think about. And that's what it's all about.
Yes, I'm suspicious when there's agreement and everybody is nodding their heads, and I just I just don't like that unanimity of response. So there are things that I avoid doing. For example, I don't go after people because it's not my style. There are some characters which I won't name that have really done so much damage that you really have to say some of that. But the idea is to, well, these are my rules. Number one, surprise the reader. Don't do what everybody is doing. So you see these columns on COVID, and COVID, we should do this, we should do that. It's all the same thing. But unless I have an interesting angle to bring, I just won't write about it. So surprise them. Maybe because I'm Cuban, I am playful, generally speaking, and I'm also playful with words. Um, Surprise them, be playful. And the third is have the readers come out of it having learned something. It's a strong pedagogical inclination that I have as a professor.
Sure.
And then if I can add a fourth, try to write in a way that reads beautifully. Prose is so important.
Yeah.
The figures of speech. I just make an effort to, and English is a very good language because of it has so many words and so many sort of synonyms, and you can select because each one means a different thing in degree. But then there's also the musicality. Which one sounds better? And as a Cuban writer, for me, that's very important. The rhythm in the writing.
Interesting. I can hardly wait to read them. And I gather that you're going to be moving further in this direction and perhaps away from academy.
Yeah, it's the academy has its comforts, so I'm not leaving the academy anytime soon. I'm just choosing my friends better, the kind of people that I want to spend time with. um, it's just a social move more than abandoning.
Yes, yes.
Now I am working on a book which is a collection of my columns from the past 2 years. I love working with titles, and so the title is All History is Contemporary History, because my columns tie the past, the present, and also the future. And the subtitle that I'm working with is Essays on Politics, Culture, and the Unimaginable Events of 2019, 2022, years that are just, you can't help it
Yeah,
but write about them.
absolutely. Go you. When is it coming out?
I believe at the end of 2022.
Okay,
So
okay.
I have to turn in the manuscripts pretty soon. And it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. Um, Writing is hard. You might as well enjoy it. And I enjoy it very much. I do it every day. I guess it has some therapeutic
Sure.
value to it as well. Um, I just love it.
Well, that's good because you're going to be doing lots of it.
Yes, there's always a book. There's always a book on my desk, a book on my shelves, and a book in my mind.
Do you feel that your Cuban background has spawned this creativity in a way?
Yes, I believe so. Cuba, some people may not have this picture clear in them. You told me your father spent time in Cuba, so he would have told you that it was a very modern place, very cosmopolitan. You think of islands as being insular, but Cuba, Havana in particular, was very cosmopolitan, and it has produced it has an over representation of artists, in all areas of art, whether it's painting, whether it's literature, whether it's ballet, whether it's architecture. The architecture is just beautiful. Unfortunately, is deteriorating. Um, but there's something to be said about the creative force among Cubans. Now, I also see myself as I'm going to use this metaphor, as a maroon writer. That is, those who don't want anything to do with a plantation. And of course, these are metaphors, right? I see myself as escaping the plantation, and the plantation in this case is the Cuba specialists, um, let me call it group, to use an uncharged term. And that's why I write the way I do. Caribbean writers tend to be maroon writers. There's great creativity in escaping, again, this metaphoric plantation, and to do your own thing and have your own voice and pursue your own rhythms. I think that's part of it. Cuba has a strong maroon culture. Uh, Not enough people know who Jose Marti was, who was the father of the Cuban nation from the 19th century, a politician, a martyr, a philosopher, a poet, a journalist. And you can't see it now because it's on the other side of my office, but I have a huge painting of Jose Marti in front of me. And he is one of my inspirations because he was courageous and he was very brave. There's a statue of him in Central Park. When Central Park South, you see the three statues of the liberators of Latin America. On the one hand, there's Simón Bolívar from Venezuela. On the other hand, San Martin from Argentina. And there you have Jose Marti in the middle. The difference is that the two other generals, who were generals, died of old age after having crossed the Andes and hundreds of battles. And here we have Jose Marti, our liberator, who died on the first day of battle. And he showed up in a three-piece suit with a pen, which he always carried. And he charged the Spanish forces, and there he was killed. Our history is a tragic history. First day of battle. So he's an inspiration for me.
I see. Well, it's beautiful to hear you talk about all of this. I have a feeling many people in our audience are not familiar with these stories and should understand history. And what you're doing is just amazing. You know, I grew up in Bermuda, 24 square miles. My dream as a little girl was to fly away, create who knows what, universes. That's an incredible experience, and you're living it today. You're creating all of this, and I'm so appreciative of it. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, I'm a teacher. I love students, young people, just to encourage them to follow their hearts. It wasn't easy for me to become a historian. I endured a lot of, I don't know, unemployment and lack of opportunities in Puerto Rico. And in the end, it paid off. I'm very happy as a historian. So to young people who may be watching this, pursue your heart, the wishes of your heart. And everybody has a vocation. And sometimes we need to work hard at finding it. And then once you find it, pursue it.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you and be inspired like that. Audience, I know that you will be too. And I hope you'll write comments on this page and let us know what you're doing. And in the meantime, please look for his books. We'll put some links on the page. And I hope that maybe in a year or so, you and I can regroup and you can tell us how things have gone.
Sure, maybe by that time, both you and I have reinvented ourselves one more time.
Oh, yeah. Tune in, folks. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.